would like to warmly welcome you to this Prevent webinar on how plastic credit support the Global Plastics Treaty. And yeah, as we have a full agenda for today, I would suggest that we already start and let people join on the go. And before we start, some housekeeping rules. So as you may have noticed, we are recording this session to make it available after the meeting as well. So we would ask you during the presentations to just turn off your cameras, and you can turn it on again in the Q&A session if you like. And please also stay muted during the presentations of our speakers. And next to the chat, you can see a little function which is called Q&A or F&A, depending on your language settings. And there you can, please feel free to add any questions that you have during the meeting, especially as here one person is not muted. So so we will collect all questions there. And the speakers will already try during the meeting to answer some of these questions. But in any case, we also have 15 minutes, 10 minutes of Q&A in the end. And in case we don't manage to answer all of the questions that you might have, we will collect them also for after the meeting. So then let's continue. As I said, we have a full agenda. So, and we will present all the speakers of the Plastic Credits core group of the Prevent Waste Alliance later again. So here's an overview of the agenda. And before we start with the topic on plastic credits, I would like to briefly introduce you to the Prevent Waste Alliance, because we have many new people here in the room today. So the Prevent Waste Alliance is an international think and do tank for circular economy practitioners with more than 500 members from more than 50 countries. All members work on circular economy are from the private sector, academia, civil society, and public institutions. The main working groups of the Prevent Waste Alliance are on plastic, e-waste, organic waste, but also some on digitalization, awareness raising, and financing the circular economy. So in general, the activities of the Prevent Waste Alliance are member-driven. So we, as Secretariat of the Alliance, we provide the platform for exchange, knowledge exchange, and joint projects. And all the discussions and opinion do not necessarily are the opinions of the whole Prevent Waste Alliance of all members, but of all the different sub-working groups that are working together. And one very active sub-working group within the Prevent Waste Alliance is the working group on plastic credits. And the plastic credits core group was established in the beginning of 2023. When the actors within or the members noticed that there are many plastic credits on the market, but common standards and transparency and harmonization is missing. So the first step on this long way of finding more to develop a harmonized position was to develop minimum requirements for the plastic credit market that will be presented later on as well. And there was an open consultation process to develop these minimum requirements, and the publication came out of it, which can be found on the Prevent website. And these consultation processes and the minimum requirements were presented at several events, such as at INC3 in Nairobi, INC4 in Ottawa, and also at IFAD in Munich in the beginning of this year. And here you can see all the members of the Plastic Credits core group. So the core group started with 16 members and now grew to 22 members, with many of the important stakeholders within the market of plastic credits. And without further ado, I would like to hand over to our first speaker today, which is Kristen Linscott from Verra. She will briefly introduce how plastic credits work. So Kristen, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So we're keeping this introduction relatively brief, but before we talk about some of these other topics, we thought it would be helpful to give everyone a starting point of what a plastic credit is. I work with Verra, one plastic standard setter, but we'll be talking about this on a more high level, not specific to any one standard. So on the next slide, we have the definition of a plastic credit. And for this, we've leaned on that which is presented in a recent report by the World Bank. This is actually a great report for anyone that wants to get a more comprehensive understanding of plastic credits, and it will be linked later in the presentation. But the World Bank defines a credit as a transferable unit representing a specific quantity of plastic that's collected and managed or recycled. And this is a type of results-based finance. And since it's all about the results and measurement, I think it's relevant to call out that most standards today have accepted 1 ton as the standard unit of measure for these credits. The next slide, we have a layout or schematic also inspired by one of the figures within this World Bank report, which highlights the different phases and entities involved in the plastic credit process. So first and foremost, you have a project that's really at the core. The project is the one implementing activities on the ground, and we'll talk through a few of these examples on the next slide, but they are the ones that are carrying out the plastic pollution reduction initiatives. And then, if they're seeking certification of their plastic credits, they would have to follow the certification process defined by whichever plastic crediting standard or program they're using. The process typically entails project registration, validation, monitoring, and verification before the plastic credits are issued. And of course, these terms and the phases will also differ from program to program, but those give you sort of an example to go off of. But what you should keep in mind are the other entities involved. Obviously, the standard setter is a key person or entity here, as they're the ones that design the plastic credit certification process, maintain the rules and requirements, and set the program rules. And then validation and verification bodies or auditors, depends on how different groups may refer to them, they will carry out audits of the activities if that's required by the relevant standard. And ultimately, once that process is complete and plastic credits are issued or available for sale, and then the plastic credits are transacted. A seller would transfer the plastic credits to either a final buyer or a trader or broker. And this is where I've highlighted that there are other entities involved that might support in the sales process. So there could be brokers and traders. There are also some marketplaces where projects might advertise their offerings. But ultimately, the final buyer is motivated to purchase and retire plastic credits to make a relevant compliance or voluntary claim or contribution relevant to their own plastic stewardship goals. And then lastly, on the next slide, I just wanted to speak about a few examples because we talk about credits and what they are, but I think it's really important to think about the core underlying activity that is being represented by whatever ton of waste has been collected or recycled. So a few examples. Some projects might be collecting through waste banks or maybe app-based aggregation schemes. A project could be implementing municipal door-to-door collection systems, collecting waste from nature or waterways, establishing or expanding on the sorting and recycling infrastructure. This all can really vary, and the specific plastic credit standard or program will define the specific types of activities or materials that are eligible. That is it from me, and hopefully provides a good 101 on plastic credits before my fellow speakers speak more about their respective topics.
Thank you very much, Kristen, and thank you especially for keeping the time. And now we have our next speaker, Thierry Sanders, who's also a member of the Prevent Steering Committee and here for BB Rio, and he will present the work of the Plastic Credits Core Group on the guidelines on minimum requirements for plastic waste recovery and crediting standards. So Thierry, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Annika, and thank you, Kristen, for laying the groundwork. So a year and a half ago, the 16 members of the Prevent Waste Alliance that were in the Plastic Credits Core Group decided to get together because we were getting very concerned by what we were seeing in the carbon credits market. And we felt that there needed to be minimum requirements for plastic credits or for plastic certification schemes. So we spent a lot of time coming up with not what the maximum standards or the best quality standards that plastic credits should meet, but what is the bare bones minimum that they should meet, because we are seeing that on the carbon credit side, that there was an erosion of trust. As a consequence, there was less funds coming into things like avoided deforestation, and we didn't want to see that happening in the plastic credits market. So we thought, okay, we need to set the standard, we need to set a bar. And okay, so Annika, can you take me to the next slide? So essentially, our core goals for this effort was we need to regain trust. Could you go to the next slide? Yeah, so if we have minimum standards, which is the little checklist box on the left, our aim is to regain trust. This will hopefully lead to more funds and more transactions in the plastic credits and plastic certificates market, which would lead, of course, to more recovery of plastic waste. So hopefully we can get this circle going. And I think everyone also needs to realize that there aren't just things called plastic credits. There's also outcomes-based finance. My own organization, BV Rio, does a lot of bilateral projects with companies who finance the recovery of plastic. And this has nothing to do with plastic credits, but in fact, the mechanism is exactly the same, because at the end of the day, we do an audit. So I think Kristen mentioned that the World Bank defined this as a results-based financing tool, and that can be a credit, it could be a certificate, it could be just a service for a payment, which is done by something which we all know called an invoice. Okay, thank you. Next slide. So the minimum requirements, and this is really a telegram style listing of the 12 minimum requirements. So they're categorized as transparency, legal compliance, and impact. And the very first thing that we decided that needs to be minimum requirements is that it is verified by an independent third party. We were seeing several certification schemes out there that had no external verification, and we felt that needs to stop. We need to stop having project developers that are issuing certificates or credits that have no external check. So that was step one. The other thing is traceability. So can we trace it from source to end destination? No double counting. Now, double counting can happen in the process of collection, and double counting can also happen in the sale of credits. So that needs to stop as well. And fourthly, which many of you have probably seen on Verra or PCX or OBP or the circular credit mechanism, you can actually see all the credits that have been issued and transferred and sold or retired. Now, we had a very long discussion about what minimum legal compliance there has to be. Well, just comply with the national law was the very basic. We had discussions about labor compliance, labor law, and labor standard compliance. But then, it would mean that almost half of the recovery projects would probably face all sorts of issues. So then on the impact side, credits are about post-consumer plastic, so not factory rejects. Also, they're about recyclable plastics that are maybe not fully commercial. So things like PET and HDPE, close to a recycling factory, those are very commercially feasible to collect and to recycle. They should really not be part of this kind of scheme. We should be looking at things like low value plastics, MLPs, flexible HD or LDs, and PET and HDPE, which is further afield, so hundreds of kilometers away. Now, then, point 8 I will cover in the next slide, but first, there are a lot of recovery of plastics that may go straight to waste to energy plants, or in co-processing, like for cement, glass, and steel. If there are very valuable plastics in there, let's sort it out so that it does get recycled. Then do no harm to communities, to the environment, of course, is essential. And then there's the question of additionality. Now, I believe the Verra standard has an additionality definition which requires more tons to be collected year on year. But the definition in the minimum requirements means that a project could actually collect 100 tons last year at the baseline, 100 tons this year. However, the waste pickers that have been involved have now received a living wage instead of being exploited. That is a form of additionality, which is called a positive list, which should also be acceptable as a credit standard. And of course, we should encourage better working conditions. Okay, next slide.
And you have 1 minute left.
Yep, that will work. So to focus on minimum requirement number 8, which states whatever we collect and recover should be delivered to a better destination. So what does that really look like? Now, there's something called the waste management hierarchy, which is usually shown as a pyramid developed by UNEP many years ago. Now, this is the same thing, except what we're saying is that waste generators are generating waste. It's being collected. If it goes down into the red part of this diagram, it's going to worse destinations. So, for example, waste that is going into an open dump site, which is the orange section here, it could be that means that it's going into an open dump site that could be burning, that could be wind, things blowing around. It's not acceptable. So managed landfill is where credits could be issued, or anything above that. So then if you are collecting, for example, from nature, from sea, and you are moving it up this chain, that is also a better destination. So those are basically the minimum requirements. Again, they are minimum, and I hope every certification system and crediting scheme will at least meet these requirements or do better. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Thierry. And now we have our next speaker, Stefanie Beitien from PCX Solutions on the plastic credit market and the Global Plastics Treaty.
Yeah, thank you so much, Annika, for the kind introduction. If you go directly to the next slide, just a word on the plastic issue. I won't dive deeper into that because I think you're all familiar with the issue in itself. And as most of you know, only 9% of plastics ever have been recycled, leaving us with actually 9 billion tons of legacy plastic waste. Now, everyone is hoping for a very strong global treaty, but even if we get a super strong treaty and we freeze production of virgin plastic today and reduce it by 40%, that would still mean that we create another 11 billion tons of additional plastic waste, which needs to be responsibly managed. And today, as many of you know, there is a huge lack of infrastructure to do so. It needs an annual investment of $1 trillion, which is an incredible sum, by the private sector to reduce mismanaged plastic by 90%, according to the Nordic Council of Ministers. And the biggest investment gaps are in the global south, where the plastic crisis actually hit the most. So there is a huge financing gap, and there is a huge issue on legacy plastic waste. If we go to the next slide. Well, the reason why nobody really picks up the plastic out in nature is that there is simply no value to it. And plastic credits assign a value to plastic waste. Now, many people say that recycled content or recycled plastic is too expensive, but the reality is that virgin plastic is simply too cheap, because the externalities that cheap virgin plastic production is causing are not priced in. Now, if you make companies take responsibility for their plastic footprint, for example, in the form of plastic credits, you basically have to add the cost of the credits to the low virgin plastic price and thereby reduce the price gap to recycled content. So plastic credits can generate an immediate impact through waste diversion and social economic benefits. And unlike carbon credits, the impact is tangible and not delivered maybe in a distant future. If the mangrove or the tree is still alive, it's a real and tangible impact that's delivered today. But they can also change the long-term unit economics of plastic, incentivizing then investments in alternative solutions and recycling infrastructure and collection and sorting, which is currently lacking a lot. It's based basically on the polluters pays principle, similar to EPR. So if we go to the next slide. The plastic credit market is still nascent. The World Bank report, which was mentioned, where we also give the link later in the chat, provides a really good background information, but it's constantly evolving actually. So in the moment, there are 5 main crediting standards. That's the Plastic Pollution Reduction Standard by PCX Solution, my organization. There is Verra with the Plastic Waste Reduction Standard. There is Circular Credits Mechanism from BV Rio. And there is Ocean-Bound Plastic from Zero Plastic Oceans, and the Recycled Material Standard from Green Blue, which works a little bit different. So there's a total estimate of over 325,000 credits that have been issued by over 160 projects, which are mainly located in Asia and Latin America, where the plastic crisis also hit the most. So if we go to the next slide. Now, plastic credits are currently discussed as part of the Global Plastics Treaty, basically as one financing mechanism, one out of many that is needed. And it can also support EPR schemes. So either before EPR is implemented as a sort of transition mechanism or as an integral part of EPR, as also Henning will explain in a bit these 2 options. But just to mention a few milestones on this slide, the World Bank had issued a $100 million bond on plastic credits back in January, which gave an important sign to the market. And also ADB published a briefing on plastic credits around the same time. Then just before the INC4, the minimum requirements were published that Thierry just mentioned, and also a report on outcomes-based financing was published by Earth Action. And then in August, there was the intersessional work in Bangkok, where plastic credits were officially on the agenda. Now we are heading to Busan for ANC5 and hope that the treaty will be signed in 2025. But also, Busan is actually not the end. It's just the start of the collaboration. It needs much more in-depth collaboration and joint efforts to really address the plastic crisis. So Busan is really just the start, and having a strong and ambitious treaty is very important to have that foundation for the joint work that's coming up. And in that, plastic credits can play an important role, both as a voluntary tool, but also as a compliance mechanism under the global treaty and under national action plans. But in order to do so, they must follow robust standards and requirements. there is not yet a harmonized framework or governing body, like the High Integrity Council for Carbon Credits, for example, or there is a newly established international advisory panel on biodiversity credits. All this is not existing yet in the plastic credit space, so there is still more work to do on consolidation and harmonization. If we go to the next slide, that's just a summary from my side, that plastic credits can really play an important role as innovative financing mechanism and enable immediate impact, because basically they don't need to wait for national legislation to be deployed. Corporates and also individuals can already take action through plastic credits. They can be tailored to locality, to plastic type, to additional benefits, and they can and should be independently audited. And they can prepare for or complement EPR schemes and address both environmental and social issue. Also, one aspect that's often overlooked, they basically provide a traceability from collection to final destination, which is getting more important to really understand the origin of recycled content as well. And yeah, most importantly, they can provide funds to address plastic pollution today. So with that, I give back to Annika. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Stefanie. And I directly give the word to Henning Wilts from the Wuppertal Institute on plastic credits and EPR schemes.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the opportunity to give this short input on the very interesting interlinkages between plastic credits and EPR. On the first slide, we see that if the overall objective is to address the root cause of the current plastic crisis with its very low level of circularity, we need to take into account the externalized environmental costs. Environmental burdens during the production and especially end-of-use phase that currently no one is paying for. And that leads to a market in which prices for plastic don't tell the environmental truth and are way too cheap, with the consequence of a severe overproduction exceeding the level of optimal welfare. And that exactly is the starting point of extended producer responsibility, or EPR, a market-based regulatory framework that obligates those who put plastic products on the market to take over the financial or physical responsibility for their products. EPR systems exist for many very different product types in very different forms. If you're interested, this recent publication gives some in-depth insights into how to establish an EPR scheme. On the next slide, we see that especially for plastic packaging waste, EPR is considered the gold standard, the close to optimal solution, because it provides reliable sources of income for long-term investments into collection and recycling infrastructures. Most EPR schemes operate on the basis of legally binding laws, so making it possible to enforce payments. Typically, the fee structure, what does the company that wants to put plastic products on the market has to pay for what, is very transparent and provides clear incentives to improve the collection and recycling. And the figure here shows the development of recycling rates in different countries after the implementation of an EPR scheme. But there are, of course, also disadvantages that need to be considered. It often takes a lot of time to establish an EPR system, especially with regard to the legal framework. There are countries that have been discussing this for almost a decade. And another point, and Stefanie mentioned that, is of course the question of legacy waste. That can be handled within an EPR system, but of course companies don't want to take over the responsibility for waste that has been put on the market by other companies. So it gets easily very complex. On the next slide, we see that against this background, with the primary objective to develop an efficient EPR system, there are typical points of criticism when it comes to plastic credits that need to be addressed. And especially, how can we avoid a situation in which plastic credits undermine the introduction of an EPR scheme? One important point is the risk of cherry picking. Collectors that aim for plastic credits could focus on the easy to collect and easily recyclable plastic waste, leaving the tricky and expensive amounts to public authorities, and then raising the cost for an EPR system. Secondly, we see that companies that already pay for plastic credits and could consider themselves as plastic neutral could resist the introduction of an EPR system, especially if that could lead to higher costs, for example, due to higher investments in infrastructures or higher environmental qualities of disposal. In a recent pilot project financed by the Prevent Alliance on Plastic Credits in India, we've seen that companies see this point very differently. Now, typically, the companies right now paying for plastic credits are very conscious of their plastic footprint, but that may, of course, change with the development of the market. On the next slide, we see that the key question against that background is how could plastic credits and EPR systems create synergies? Or more specifically, how could the support for plastic credits, for example, in the treaty, boost the establishment of an EPR system? And there are two very different options. The first one, the more evolutionary approach, we start with plastic credits using the advantage that they can be implemented much faster and use that as a first step towards an EPR system. This approach would mean that we use plastic credits to showcase the benefits of collection and disposal of plastic waste, especially to the general public, and with regard to companies, we try to raise awareness of their responsibility for the end of life. Plastic credits could, of course, also be used to finance basic infrastructures, for example, with regards to collection trials that might also contribute to providing necessary data on the waste amounts that are generated, the composition of the plastic waste related costs. All that could contribute then to the establishment of a of an EPR system. So we use the plastic credits as a booster for the introduction of an hopefully mandatory national or regional EPR system. That is option A. Option B, and you'll see that on the second slide, what we call an integrated approach. Their plastic credits could become part of an EPR system, and that is something that we've seen recently in the Philippines. Now, here, the plastic credits can contribute to an eco-modulation of fees. Companies can use plastic credits to reduce their responsibilities to collect and dispose plastic waste. Here, in this case, in terms of plastic waste amounts, typically with regards to the fees that they have to pay. Now, that works also in countries like France, where such reductions can be achieved by educational measures. And here in the Philippines, the financing of plastic credits and basically the waste diversion can be used by paying for these certificates. The case study shows that, and if you're interested, have a look at this really interesting report, that this can also lead to the mobilization of private investments. It can provide additional investments, especially with regard to cooperation with the informal sector of waste pickers. And in this way, plastic credits in this integrated approach can be seen as an option for an increased efficiency of EPR system, so achieving better results at lower costs. We come already to my final slide. There you see, this figure shows you how in the Philippines plastic credits are integrated as one of 6 potential downstream modules for companies that have to fulfill their responsibilities. So this is a way to go, but my key message is that not only an ambitious harmonized standard as presented by Thierry with the minimum requirements will make the difference between a cheap way out, plastic credit basically as greenwashing, and a really valuable contribution to EPR system. So the question is not if plastic credits are good or not, the question is how they are implemented and if there is a government system in place to actually monitor that. With that, thanks a lot, really looking forward to the further discussion.
Thank you very much, Henning. So now we already come to our last presentation before the Q&A by Oliver Kade by 7 Clean Seas on the socio-economic aspects in the plastic credit market. So Ollie, the floor is yours.
Thank you for the introduction, Annika. If you don't mind moving to the first slide. Essentially, I think I'm not going to labor the point of global mismanaged waste, but I think one thing that we really need to focus on is the role of the informal sector within the global plastic leakage crisis. So ultimately, the informal sector, which often floats under the radar, they can collect and have contributed to the collection of over 27 million tons of plastic globally based off of 2016 data. So they're a significant stakeholder in the global plastic waste management crisis. Really, though, because they are quite often informal communities, they're likely to be underpaid, earning between $1 to $8 working in unsafe working conditions. And that's what we mean when we're talking about social economic benefits within this space. So if you don't mind going to the next slide. The key benefit that I also wanted to draw from the World Bank report is the identification of these marginalized groups. So Kristen earlier showed the role of plastic credits within the system and the different stakeholders. And if we can target these marginalized groups, we can use the increased revenue into the system to provide more social and better social and environmental conditions. Really, we're quite often operating in a broken economic model with plastic waste management, particularly in remote areas. So if we're able to rebalance the equation around the economics, or using plastic credits or other innovative results-based financing, then really we'd be able to address a lot of these challenges. That means providing healthcare, health and safety equipment, training, women's only toilets, daycare facilities, and all sorts of other elements that we would expect from formal employment rights. And if you don't mind going to the next slide. These are, in general, the areas that we're talking about when how can we boost social economic impact in plastic waste management. We're talking about child welfare and education support. Obviously, if we're operating in areas where there's large informal communities, we need to make sure that there's a correct child protection, welfare, making sure that children are getting access to education. We also need to focus on the education of the communities themselves. That means upskilling programs, empowerment programs, really trying to focus on that personal development so that we can alleviate people out of impoverished communities. Health and safety, occupational health and safety is obviously a really key point that we need to always address with any area of employment, and that goes to so the same in the credit space. But one thing that we quite often overlook is representation and advocacy, because really when we're talking about marginalized groups, because they're quite often floating under the radar, they don't actually have basic rights to representation that we would all consider in our day-to-day lives, and therefore providing space for these benefits within the communities is really important. Of course, fair compensation and financial security, and of course, ethical working standards are really important. That means anti-discrimination policies, codes of conduct, these kind of things. If you don't mind going to the next slide, we've already talked a little bit about the role of certifications in terms of minimum requirement. But on the element of social safeguards, nearly all of the standards that we've highlighted here or we've heard from today already have elements of social safeguards embedded into the minimum program requirements. They vary from program to program, but really the key point is making sure health and safety standards are there, that there's no forced labor, no child labor, grievance mechanisms for key stakeholders, and other sorts of additional social benefits. However, there are a few standards that do provide additional benefits. So if you don't mind moving on to the next slide, in particular, the PPRS from PCX and Circular Credit Mechanism from BV Rio also have, and Thierry already mentioned this with an element of a positive list. But essentially what this is ways where projects that have social safeguards incorporated into their day-to-day operations, there are paths of least resistance in order to achieving plastic credit certifications. So that means if you have the correct social safeguards in process and that you can prove additionality in investing in those social economic benefits, then you can actually have a documentation proof of additionality in the project, meaning that you pass those additionality criteria. And just to give an example from PCX, they have an element of qualitative additionality, which covers this social element. So if you can justify that you're using plastic credits as a mechanism to increase wages or to shift from a material-based income, which is purchasing waste through a bank sample or a kind of waste bank, to a service-based income where you're employing people to actually go out and provide the waste management service for plastic recovery or recycling, and then also providing social benefits. These examples of how you can provide projects that have these programs in place easier paths to certification. However, we can't really talk about certifications without mentioning OBP Social Plus, if you don't mind going to the next slide. Now, what OBP Social Plus is trying to do is it's not a plastic credit certification in the
Okay, I think we've lost Ollie. Let's wait a second whether he will join again.
Apologies for that. It appears I got kicked out for some reason. So regarding OBP Social Plus, the key is that it's a bolt-on standard which goes beyond the plastic crediting programs, that focuses on the social safeguards, largely for informal communities, but also for formal employees. So it's the first of its kind standard that's trying to address informal waste pickers. And the key goal of this standard is to provide these communities with similar direct and indirect benefits from informal employment. So the key point is we're identifying this marginal group, and what we're trying to do is provide a stepping stone for these informal communities to work towards formalization. And that's by providing with them all the direct benefits of formal employment without having to make that step to formal employment. The goal is, of course, to get to that point. Now, just to give you an idea of how this actually works in application, if you don't mind going to the next slide, there are 6 program requirements that project proponents would need to meet. The first one is making sure that they have a community manager. This is an individual within an organization that's responsible for maintaining the relationships between the informal communities. And that means keeping records, keeping IDs, track and personal documentation, so that we understand who is it that's within our supply chain, and that we have the correct information to make sure that they're accounted for. Making sure that child protection is there. And that doesn't mean no child labor. That means beyond that. So making sure that the communities are trained in why child labor is problematic, conducting regular inspections, and in cases where there might be chances of child labor, making sure that these are actioned, i.e. providing solutions policies to prevent that happening again in the future. Occupational health and safety, beyond bare minimum, providing insurance, monitoring, and access to medical care. Of course, we need to think about right of representation and also access to financial administrations. But I think the real key here is that whatever transactions from a monetary perspective that we have with informal communities, making sure that there's clear records. And in doing so, trying to find domiciliation so that we can actually formally bring these community members into the legal system, and supporting them from a financial perspective if they want to work towards achieving microloans. And that means financial independence is essentially what we're discussing here. Empowerment beyond just providing workshops, but making sure they're actioned, and that really is providing a voice to these communities. And then, of course, the most important point is fair compensation. So that means that, yes, if you're purchasing on a commodity basis, that yes, you're paying market price, but you're also paying a purchase premium on top of that, and making sure that that's communicated to communities as to why that premium is. I saw a question in the chat that was talking about if a project proponent is utilizing an informal collector community, who's benefiting from the plastic credits? Is it the informal community, or is it the project proponent? The intention here is that you want it to be a trickle-down effect. In order to achieve the certifications, you need to have the correct policies, procedures, legal compliance in place, and that has to come from a project proponent. But if they're utilizing a collector community, then you want to make sure that the revenue generation from plastic credits is making its way down to the very bottom, right? And that's what we're trying to do. Now, on to the next slide. I think we talked about paths to formal employment, and that's where I wanted to end on a case study. So ultimately, we wanted to demonstrate the fact that plastic credits can be used for formal employment, and that's exactly what we do. So through our plastic credit generation, we have been able to provide over 106 formal jobs to waste communities that we operate in various project locations. And on top of that, it means having the correct social safeguards, minimum wage or living wage, whichever's highest, 5-day working weeks that don't exceed 48 hours of work on a week, long-term contracts to provide job security, bonus salaries to provide additional financial independence, not just for the community, but also for the family structure. And then bonus food budgets, social security, holiday, maternity, paternity. But you also, when you're working for paths of formalization, you also need to implement the policies, procedures, and standard operating processes in place, having the health and safety processes, having the anti-discrimination, providing equal opportunities, making sure that there's no child labor. And ultimately, under the OBP Social Plus standard, that is also a program requirement. So for all formal employees, you need to make sure that they pass the Ethical Trade Initiative's base code for ethical employment. And that's ultimately what we're trying to do. And I think that really what you can see here is the minimum requirements from the standards, right, that make their way gradually up to this point of formal employment. And we're seeing that it is working. And for that, I'm going to end my slide and hand over to the Q&A session. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ollie, and thank you to all of you to really keeping the time today and for making my job easy as a facilitator. So now, as Ollie already said, we are going to the Q&A session, and I'm happy to have Sarah here to support me with that. So Sarah Hadley from Plastic Collective, the floor is yours. So which questions would you like to raise from the Q&A?
Thanks, Annika. And just a reminder, so we'll get through as many as we can in the next 10 minutes, but any that we don't get to, we'll circle back, collate them and respond by email. So I think we'll start from the bottom and work our way up to the top. The first one here from Desiree, I think this would be a good one for you, Kristen, to respond to. So Desiree saying that the typical unit of measurement of plastic credits is tonnes. However, depending on the ecosystem where we collect post-consumer plastics, the collected weight differs given a similar effort. For example, collection from waterways is also about microplastics, kilos, not tonnes. Do credit schemes take this into account?
Yeah, this is one where I'm happy to speak from our perspective at Verra, but I know others might want to chime in also. I think the standard unit of measure is important, but we recognize that a diversity of activities will actually underpin those credits, and that maybe the different impact could also be reflected in the price that a credit is ultimately sold for. So we haven't made adjustments for like the types of materials and how those are quantified, but say a project was focusing on microplastics, if they're able to actually collect, weigh, and measure those, then they would follow whatever the standard measurement for the system was. And then I think the kind of impact equivalency element, if we say, might come through in the value that the buyer purchases the credit for ultimately.
Great, thank you for that, Kristen. Stefanie, anything you would want to add from a PCX perspective?
Nope, I think all covered for this one.
Great, okay, thanks. All right, let's move on to the next one then. So Johanna is asking, is ABS from e-waste included in the non-commercial plastic streams? So this is potentially a hierarchy type question. I wonder, Thierry, if you could have a first stab at responding to that one. Thierry? Oops, that was my... I think you're on mute, Thierry. No sound. Okay. Let's move on from that one. We'll come back to that one. Okay, let's come back to that one. Right, moving on then. So we've got a long question, rather detailed question here from Akeem. around how the measurement and potential double counting. So again, this might be one that perhaps you can take, Stefanie. So let's take a look at this. So Akeem's asking, if I purchase from collectors and aggregators plastic waste, and then I use my business to produce my product and I sell the product, A, does the collector or aggregator get the plastic credits? Who pays for them? Do I also get plastic credits as the business? And then C, would it not be double counting to have those two transactions?
Okay, I can give it a try, and then Kristen can add on, because our two standards work slightly different. So just from a PPRS point of view, a plastic credit always needs to be end-to-end. So that means the ton of plastic has to be collected, transported, aggregated, and processed to end of waste destination. That altogether, this full chain constitutes a credit in our case. And again, Kristen can speak on the Verra model. And so the project partner can be anyone in the supply chain, and he or she will distribute the value equally throughout the supply chain. So the project partner needs to have an agreement with the other players in the supply chain. So if it's the collector, he needs to have an agreement, and the value of the credit will be shared until the processor, and the other way around. So I hope that addresses the question A and C in a way. If they are producing recycled content that it's sold on, that's great. But as we also discussed in another question in the chat, unfortunately, today, very often recycled content business is not yet fully viable. So often it's not enough to cover the cost for the OPEX mainly, to really cover costs to pay fair wages and so on. So basically the additionality criteria could be either that the business in itself is not financially viable without the support of plastic credits, or thanks to the plastic credits, the recycler can provide additional benefits, stable employment, anything like social benefits, what's above what's legally mandated. So all of that could prove a qualitative additionality. So in that sense, that wouldn't be double counting. If also the sale of the recycled content generates some revenue, that's okay. That's not double counting. I hope I got it. It was a long question. And Kristen, yeah, feel free to add on.
Yeah, I think I would just maybe use it as an opportunity. It all goes back to the standards too, and like what they're determining. I was just skimming this question, but I know like for us, we have collection and recycling credits, and it's really important for those involved in the collection activities or the recycling activities respectively to be the ones seeking to like generate those credits. So that's where I think probably reaching out to standard setters specifically is probably the best way to get more specific information on your question. But it's a good example of the complexity of some of these eligibility questions.
Yeah, that's right. Yes, there is certainly a degree of complexity, but thank you very much, both of you. I think that's provide us with a comprehensive answer to that one. Right, the next question is also from Johanna, and it's focusing on generation of credits from the avoidance of plastic. So I guess it's an upstream question. I wonder, Henning, if perhaps this is one you might be able to tackle. So the exact question is it possible to generate credits already for plastic that is not produced or plastic avoided?
Yeah, thanks a lot for that question. I think that is a really important next step for the concept and idea of plastic credits. I mean, it's nice that we can improve plastic recycling, but in the end, we want to contribute to avoidance. And I think there is already an indirect effect by making plastic a bit more expensive. It creates, of course, some incentives for companies to think about the more efficient use of the material. But I think the more interesting approach could be to think about plastic credits, for example, for reuse systems. There we are in urgent need of additional financing instruments. But we of course also have to take into account the higher we get in the waste hierarchy, the more complex it gets to really understand the causality, what is causing what, and that could open also the doors for greenwashing. And we have to be really careful to have a robust methodology before going into that direction.
Great, thank you. Thanks very much. I think that's exactly right, and being able to include the upstream at some point in a robust manner would be very beneficial. Have we got time for one more question? One last question? Great. So this one is from Amarul, and I think, Ollie, this is one that you might be able to respond to. So even though PET and HDPE are amongst the most collected and recycled types of plastic, recycling rates globally are still very low. And the informal collectors which collect these plastics are still facing various human rights and social issues. Are we condemning PET and HDPE collectors to this fate if we say they shouldn't qualify for plastic credits?
It's a great question. Actually, I would argue it's the opposite. So the whole argument for why the other plastics are so low value is that the cost to collect, recycle, sort these plastics is so high that compared to the material value that you can generate post-recycling. So if you can use innovative financing mechanisms such as plastic credits to create a market demand for them, then you can drive down the total costs and therefore justify recycling a lot of these low value plastics such as the LDPEs. So one of the caveats for plastic credits is if you can subsidize collection costs, then what you're trying to do is ultimately increase feedstock so that you can drive more recycling in the market. So that's really ultimately, when we talk about EPR policies, one of the main goals of EPR policy should also not just be recovery of plastic, but should also be increasing feedstock of recycled material. And that creates a demand which ultimately helps informal collectors.
Excellent, thanks so much, Ollie. I'll hand back to you then. I think we're out of time question-wise, and I've just noticed there's quite a few more questions, but as I said, we'll circle back with responses to those offline. So thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sarah, and to all of you other speakers for today. Thank you very much for your great presentations. So before ending the sessions, we would also like to share with you some recent publications on plastic credit. Of course, the one on guidelines on minimum requirements of plastic waste recovery and crediting standards by the Plastic Credit Core Group, then the report by the World Bank on unlocking financing to combat the plastics crisis, then another discussion paper on plastic credits and as an innovative financial instrument by Verra, and another report by PCX Solutions on extended producer responsibility in the Philippines. And finally, also one publication by the Wuppertal Institute on financing circular plastic systems. And yeah, you can find the links in the presentations that we will share after the meeting, and also here in the QR codes if you're already curious right now. And thank you very much again for all the questions. We see that there are a lot in the chat and in the Q&A, and we will definitely collect all of them and find a way to answer them in written form afterwards. And yeah, if you're now interested to learn more about the Prevent Waste Alliance, I think my colleague Noelle just shared a link to our website in the chat. And you can always reach out to us via our contact email, which is contact@prevent-waste.net. So there we will receive all of your questions. Also, if some questions also come up after the event. And yeah, feel free to reach out to us.